The annual St. Mary Mead Summer Festival had unfolded with its customary gentle precision, the village green transformed into a tableau of quintessential English charm. Bunting fluttered between ancient oak trees, trestle tables groaned beneath homemade preserves and intricate needlework, and the cheerful, if slightly discordant, strains of the village band drifted across manicured lawns. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, lending everything a golden, nostalgic quality that seemed to suspend time itself. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly beneath a striped awning, her knitting resting in her lap, pale blue eyes observing the familiar scene with the gentle attention of one who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly in moments of supposed tranquility. She watched Mrs. Bantry directing the cake stall with military efficiency, Colonel Weatherby regaling a captive audience with increasingly elaborate war stories, and young Timothy Forsyth hovering near the bookstall with the earnest intensity of someone convinced that literature held all of life's answers. The centerpiece of this year's festivities was undoubtedly Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the village's most intriguing resident. At 62, Eleanor possessed the kind of vibrant energy that seemed to mock the very concept of aging. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 years prior, purchasing Rose Cottage with what the villagers whispered was a substantial inheritance from her late husband's London business ventures. What truly set Eleanor apart, however, was her passion for dancing, not the structured waltzes or country reels that graced village halls, but an expressive, almost theatrical style that she performed with abandon, often alone in her drawing room or, more memorably, at village gatherings where she would eschew partners for her own uninhibited movements. Today, Eleanor commanded attention in a striking emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair, now elegantly silver-streaked. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her laughter ringing across the green as she charmed the committee ladies and flirted harmlessly with Dr. Haydock, much to his wife's barely concealed irritation. "Such spirit for her age," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, settling beside Miss Marple with a disapproving sniff. "Though one does wonder if it's entirely appropriate, all that exuberance." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I find that people express joy in their own particular ways, dear. Mrs. Vance seems to have found hers." As the afternoon progressed, the festival reached its traditional crescendo with the announcement of the Maypole dance. The village band struck up a lively folk tune, and couples began gathering around the decorated pole. It was then that Eleanor Vance truly came into her element. Rather than joining the prescribed weaving of ribbons, she positioned herself at the dance's periphery and began to move with a fluid grace that transformed the simple country melody into something almost magical. Her movements were neither showy nor inappropriate, but possessed a quality of pure expression that seemed to capture something essential about the joy of being alive. Children stopped their games to watch, elderly gentlemen nodded approvingly, and even Mrs. Price Ridley's stern expression softened slightly. Miss Marple observed not only Eleanor's performance, but the faces of those watching, noting Dr. Haydock's professional interest in her remarkable vitality, Timothy Forsyth's obvious fascination, and the complex mixture of admiration and envy in several of the younger women's expressions. As the music concluded to enthusiastic applause, Eleanor curtsied playfully and announced her intention to freshen up before the prize-giving ceremony, where she was scheduled to present the cup for the best-kept garden. She gathered her small beaded purse and disappeared behind the refreshment marquee, her emerald dress a bright splash of color against the white canvas. The festival continued its gentle wind-down. Raffle results were announced, children were rounded up by increasingly weary parents, and the golden afternoon light began to fade toward evening. It was Mrs. Henderson who first voiced concern, her usually cheerful face creased with worry as she approached the small group gathered near the prize table. "Has anyone seen Eleanor?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that seemed to ripple through the crowd. "She's been gone nearly 20 minutes, and she's never late for anything." A few people shrugged, suggesting she might have returned home or found a quiet spot to rest. But as minutes stretched into half an hour, the atmosphere began to shift. Eleanor Vance, for all her eccentricities, was nothing if not reliable, particularly regarding her social obligations. Mr. Clement, the vicar, organized a small search party. Voices calling Eleanor began to echo across the green as people checked behind stalls and peered into the few motor cars parked along the lane. Miss Marple remained seated, but her attention had sharpened considerably. She had observed Eleanor entering the area behind the refreshment marquee, and something about the quality of the silence from that direction troubled her. The piercing scream that suddenly rent the evening air came from Mrs. Gribble, the postmistress, whose voice carried clearly across the green. "Oh, dear God, someone come quickly." The crowd converged behind the marquee, where the overgrown hedge bordering the vicarage garden cast deep shadows. There, partially concealed by a rhododendron bush, lay a figure in emerald silk. Eleanor Vance's vibrant energy had been extinguished forever, her still form a stark contradiction to the graceful dancer who had captivated them all mere hours before. Miss Marple rose slowly, her keen eyes already noting details that others, in their shock, would overlook. The widow who danced alone would dance no more, and the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been thrust into a mystery that would test even her considerable understanding of human nature. The murmur of shocked voices rippled through the gathering crowd as Dr. Haydock pushed forward, his medical bag clutched firmly in one hand. The jovial festival atmosphere had evaporated entirely, replaced by the hushed, electric tension that accompanies sudden tragedy. He knelt beside Eleanor's still form with professional composure, though Miss Marple, observing from her position near the vicarage gate, noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he checked for signs of life that everyone already knew would not be found. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of medical training. "Mrs. Gribble, would you telephone the police? Mr. Clement, perhaps you could help keep everyone at a respectful distance." Eleanor lay as if she had simply chosen to rest among the rhododendrons, her emerald dress barely disturbed save for a few leaves that had settled on the silk. Her face, turned slightly toward the darkening sky, bore an expression of mild surprise rather than pain or distress. The small beaded purse she had carried lay a few feet away, its contents scattered across the grass. A lace handkerchief, a small silver compact, and what appeared to be a folded piece of paper that fluttered slightly in the evening breeze. Miss Marple approached slowly, her knitting bag held loosely in one hand, pale blue eyes taking in details that others, in their shock and confusion, were overlooking entirely. Eleanor's dancing shoes showed no signs of struggle, no scuff marks or displaced earth that might suggest she had been dragged or had fought against an attacker. More intriguingly, the positioning of her body seemed almost peaceful, as if she had simply lain down for a moment's rest. "Heart attack, most likely," Dr. Haydock murmured to the vicar, though his tone carried a note of professional uncertainty. She appeared to be in excellent health, but these things can happen suddenly, particularly with the excitement of the day. Mrs. Price Ridley had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her earlier disapproval of Eleanor's spirited dancing now transformed into what appeared to be genuine distress. To think we were all here, enjoying ourselves, while poor Eleanor— She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, though Miss Marple detected a certain satisfaction beneath the woman's shock that suggested she found a grim validation in this turn of events. "When did anyone last see her alive?" Colonel Weatherby asked, his military bearing asserting itself in the face of crisis. "We must establish a timeline for the authorities." The answers came in fragments, each villager contributing their piece of the puzzle with varying degrees of certainty and obvious discomfort. Mrs. Henderson had seen Eleanor heading toward the refreshment area around 4:30, her usual cheerful demeanor intact. Young Timothy Forsyth admitted, with considerable embarrassment, that he had glimpsed her speaking with someone behind the marquee perhaps 10 minutes later, though he couldn't identify the other person from his position near the bookstall. "I didn't want to appear to be, well, watching," Timothy stammered, his academic composure thoroughly shattered. "But she was such a remarkable woman, so full of life. It seemed impossible that she could just—" Mrs. Bantry mentioned seeing a flash of green fabric near the hedge around 4:45, but had assumed it was Eleanor taking a moment's rest after her energetic dancing. "She seemed perfectly well," Mrs. Bantry insisted, as if her observation might somehow reverse the tragedy before them. Miss Marple listened to these accounts with careful attention, noting not only what was said, but how it was said, and more importantly, what remained unspoken. Timothy's reluctance seemed to stem from embarrassment rather than concealment, though his obvious fascination with Eleanor raised questions about the nature of his interest. Mrs. Bantry's precision suggested someone accustomed to organizing events and observing details, while Mrs. Henderson's distress appeared genuine and uncomplicated. The arrival of Inspector Slack, announced by the sound of a motor car engine and the crunch of gravel, brought a different energy to the scene. He emerged from the police vehicle with characteristic briskness, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation with professional detachment. Miss Marple had encountered Inspector Slack before and knew him to be a competent, if somewhat impatient, investigator who preferred straightforward solutions to complex mysteries. Right then, Inspector Slack announced, surveying the assembled villagers with the air of a man accustomed to taking charge. "I'll need statements from everyone who was present this afternoon. Constable Polk, secure the area. No one touches anything until we've had a proper look." He knelt beside Eleanor's body, examining the scene with methodical efficiency. After a few minutes, he rose and dusted off his knees, his expression suggesting he had already formed preliminary conclusions. "Appears to be natural causes," he declared to Dr. Haydock. "Lady of a certain age, excitement of the festival, perhaps overexerted herself with all that dancing. These things happen, unfortunately." Miss Marple found herself studying the inspector's confident assessment with growing unease. While Eleanor's death might indeed prove natural, something about the scene troubled her experienced eye. The complete absence of any sign that Eleanor had felt unwell or sought help, the peaceful expression on her face, the way her body was positioned, these details created a pattern that didn't quite align with sudden cardiac failure. As the crowd began to disperse under Inspector Slack's direction, voices already carrying the first whispers of gossip and speculation, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Haydock lingering near the hedge. His expression was thoughtful, almost troubled, and when he caught her observing him, he approached with obvious relief at finding someone whose discretion he trusted. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I wonder if I might have a word." They walked slowly toward the edge of the green, away from the remaining onlookers and the constables now securing the scene. Dr. Haydock's usual jovial manner had been replaced by professional concern mixed with something approaching confusion. "I've known Eleanor Vance for 3 years," he began, his voice low but clear. "Examined her just last month for a minor complaint about headaches. Her heart was sound, blood pressure excellent, general health remarkable for a woman her age. She had the constitution of someone 20 years younger." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, sensing there was more to come, her keen mind already cataloguing the implications of this information. "What troubles me," Dr. Haydock continued, "is her expression and the positioning of her body. I've seen many cases of sudden cardiac arrest, and there's usually some indication of distress, pain, recognition of what's happening. Eleanor looks surprised, yes, but not distressed, as if something unexpected occurred, but not necessarily something that caused her immediate physical suffering." The evening shadows were lengthening across the village green, transforming the scene of afternoon celebration into something altogether more somber. The bunting still fluttered cheerfully between the trees, a jarring reminder of the festivities that had been so abruptly curtailed, and Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Eleanor Vance's death was quite as straightforward as Inspector Slack seemed determined to believe. Dr. Haydock's quiet assessment lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she observed the methodical process of Inspector Slack's investigation. The doctor's professional instincts carried considerable weight, particularly given his personal acquaintance with Eleanor's robust health. His description of her expression, surprised rather than distressed, painted a picture that didn't align neatly with sudden cardiac failure, though Miss Marple kept this observation to herself as she watched the inspector's confident handling of the scene. Inspector Slack emerged from behind the marquee holding a small evidence envelope, his expression suggesting he had discovered something of significance. The folded piece of paper that had scattered from Eleanor's beaded purse was now secured as potential evidence, though Slack's manner indicated he considered it merely a formality in what he clearly viewed as a straightforward case of natural death. "Routine correspondence," he announced to Constable Pork, though Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his voice. "We'll examine it properly at the station, but it appears to be a brief note arranging a meeting, signed with an initial J, which narrows our inquiries somewhat. The revelation of a prearranged meeting cast Eleanor's final movements in a different light entirely. Rather than wandering behind the marquee for a moment's rest or privacy, she had apparently gone there with a specific purpose, to meet someone who had requested her presence away from the festival's public activities. This suggested a level of premeditation that complicated Inspector Slack's preferred narrative of spontaneous natural death. Young Timothy Forsyth, who had been hovering at the edge of the investigative activity with obvious discomfort, approached Miss Marple as the crowd began to thin. His scholarly composure had returned somewhat, though his hands still betrayed nervous energy as he adjusted his spectacles with characteristic academic precision. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "I fear I wasn't entirely forthcoming with Inspector Slack about my observations this afternoon. Not from any desire to mislead, you understand, but because I wasn't certain of the significance." Miss Marple encouraged him with a gentle smile, her knitting needles resuming their soft rhythm as she waited for him to continue. Timothy's careful speech patterns reflected his academic background, but his current agitation suggested he was grappling with information that troubled him considerably. "When I mentioned seeing Mrs. Vance speaking with someone behind the marquee," Timothy continued, lowering his voice, "I couldn't identify the other person from my position near the bookstall. However, I did observe something about their interaction that struck me as rather intense. Not angry, precisely, but certainly more serious than the casual social encounters one expects at a village festival." This revelation added depth to the mystery of Eleanor's final minutes. If she had indeed arranged to meet someone for what appeared to be a serious conversation, it suggested the kind of deliberate planning that contradicted any theory of accidental death during innocent festival participation. Miss Marple filed away Timothy's observation while continuing to watch the various villagers as they provided their statements to the increasingly impatient inspector. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed into a hive of whispered speculation and nervous energy. The festival's cheerful decorations, still hanging forlornly between the oak trees, seemed to mock the village's new preoccupation with sudden death and hidden motives. Mrs. Gribble, still shaken by her discovery of Eleanor's body, had taken to her bed, leaving the post office in the hands of her assistant, where the usual exchange of letters was now punctuated by fervent gossip and amateur theorizing. The name that began to circulate with increasing frequency was Mr. Josiah Crawley, a recent arrival who had purchased the old mill house 6 months prior. Crawley possessed the unfortunate combination of being both an outsider and thoroughly disagreeable, having quickly earned a reputation for argumentative behavior and litigious tendencies. His ongoing boundary dispute with Eleanor over a small strip of land had provided the village with considerable entertainment, particularly after their public confrontation outside the post office the previous week. "Heard him threaten her myself," Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone willing to listen, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had predicted disaster. "Called her a meddling busybody and said he'd make her regret interfering with his property rights. Mark my words, that man has a violent temper." Inspector Slack appeared particularly receptive to this line of inquiry, and by afternoon, word spread that Crawley had been taken in for questioning. The village's collective relief was palpable. The mystery had been solved, the obvious suspect apprehended, and normal life could resume. The unpleasant outsider had committed the unpleasant deed, fitting neatly into the kind of straightforward narrative that satisfied both police efficiency and community psychology. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly skeptical of this convenient resolution. She had observed Crawley at the festival, nursing his customary scowl near the beer tent, seemingly oblivious to Eleanor's dancing or subsequent disappearance. While his temper was undeniable, his anger tended toward the loud and public variety, rather than the subtle calculation required for whatever had befallen Eleanor behind the marquee. More troubling were the details that didn't align with Crawley's supposed guilt. The mysterious note with its careful initial J suggested someone with more sophistication than the blunt mill owner typically displayed. Eleanor's peaceful expression and undisturbed positioning indicated something far more subtle than the kind of violent confrontation Crawley's temperament would produce. The timing, too, seemed wrong. Why would a man who threatened Eleanor publicly choose such a crowded, chaotic event for revenge, and why employ such an apparently gentle method? As evening approached and news of Crawley's detention spread through the village, Miss Marple found herself considering the deeper currents that flowed beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Eleanor Vance, with her vibrant personality and mysterious wealth, had undoubtedly attracted both admiration and envy during her 3 years in the village. Her death, Miss Marple suspected, was rooted not in a simple property dispute, but in something far more complex and personal, the kind of hidden resentment or secret betrayal that festered in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. The true killer, she mused as she walked slowly home through the familiar lanes, was likely still among them, perhaps even contributing to the convenient narrative. Forming around poor Mr. Crawley, watching with satisfaction as the village's attention focused on the obvious, disagreeable outsider, while the real truth remained safely hidden beneath layers of respectability and assumed innocence. The collapse of Inspector Slack's case against Josiah Crawley came with the swift efficiency that characterized the inspector's better moments, though his expression suggested he found little satisfaction in his own thoroughness. By mid-morning, Crawley's alibi had been verified beyond doubt. Colonel Weatherby himself confirmed that the disagreeable mill owner had spent the crucial period from 4:15 until well past 5 o'clock engaged in a vociferous dispute about the quality of the beer tent's offerings, his voice carrying clearly across the green in a manner that made concealment impossible. Miss Marple received this news while arranging flowers at Rose Cottage, having volunteered for the melancholy task of preparing Eleanor's home for the inevitable stream of condolence visitors. The revelation that the obvious suspect was innocent confirmed her growing conviction that Eleanor's death was rooted in something far more complex than a simple boundary dispute between neighbors. Inspector Slack's subsequent visit to Rose Cottage revealed the true content of the mysterious note, which proved far more intriguing than his initial assessment had suggested. "Eleanor," it read in careful, educated script, "must speak with you privately about the London matter. Behind the refreshment tent at 4:30. Most urgent, J." The reference to the London matter transformed the entire complexion of the case, suggesting that Eleanor's death was connected not to her 3 years in St. Mary Mead, but to secrets from her carefully concealed past. Miss Marple's exploration of Eleanor's study, conducted with the innocent purposefulness of someone arranging household effects, yielded additional clues that painted a disturbing picture of hidden complications. The writing desk's blotter revealed not only the penciled telephone number with its Kensington exchange, but also traces of correspondence that suggested ongoing contact with someone from Eleanor's former life. 2 letters bearing a distinctive JV monogram lay beneath the blotter, their expensive paper still carrying the faint trace of masculine cologne that spoke of wealth and refinement. More telling was what Miss Marple discovered in the drawing room, or rather, what she didn't discover. Among the carefully arranged photographs on the mantelpiece, a distinct gap marked where a frame had once stood, its absence emphasized by the clean rectangle of wood beneath. The remaining photographs told the story of Eleanor's London life. Charity balls, social gatherings, and a formal portrait of a young boy in an Eton collar whose relationship to Eleanor remained mysteriously undefined. The household staff provided additional pieces to the emerging puzzle. Jessie Drew, the pale young maid whose nervousness had intensified since her mistress's death, revealed that Eleanor had received a visitor on the morning of the festival, a tall gentleman with a London accent who had left only the cryptic calling card with its single initial and telephone number. Eleanor's subsequent behavior had been subtly different, marked by an unusual distraction that suggested the visitor's message had caused considerable concern. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor's closest neighbor and friend, added crucial context to these revelations when she confided her own observations to Miss Marple. Eleanor's stories of London society, while entertaining, had always been curiously vague about her late husband's business affairs. Any direct questions about Mr. Vance's work were deflected with practiced ease, suggesting deliberate concealment rather than mere disinterest in financial matters. More significantly, Mrs. Henderson recalled Eleanor's distress approximately a month earlier upon receiving a letter that had clearly shaken her composure. Eleanor's cryptic comment about someone from the past who couldn't leave well enough alone now took on sinister implications in light of subsequent events. The timeline suggested a pattern of escalating pressure, beginning with written communication and culminating in the fatal meeting behind the refreshment marquee. The village's reaction to Crawley's release revealed the complex psychology of a community confronted with an unsolved mystery. The initial relief at having identified a convenient scapegoat gave way to nervous speculation as residents realized the killer remained among them. Mrs. Price Ridley's disappointment at the loss of a dramatic resolution was palpable, while others began casting suspicious glances at neighbors they had previously trusted without question. Young Timothy Forsyth's continued observations proved particularly valuable to Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's true nature. His description of Eleanor's final conversation, marked by nervous gestures and intimate proximity rather than heated argument, contradicted any theory of violent confrontation. The timing he provided, anchored to the angle of sunlight on the marquee canvas, established a precise timeline that would prove crucial to identifying the real killer. Dr. Haydock's persistent unease about Eleanor's death provided professional validation for Miss Marple's instincts. His medical assessment of Eleanor's robust health made sudden cardiac failure increasingly implausible, while her peaceful expression and undisturbed positioning suggested something far more subtle than natural death. The doctor's determination to pursue a thorough inquest, despite pressure for a convenient conclusion, indicated his own suspicions about the official explanation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple began to construct a mental portrait of Eleanor's killer that bore no resemblance to the brutish Crawley. This was someone educated and sophisticated, familiar with Eleanor's London past, and calculating enough to exploit the chaos of a village festival for murderous purposes. The killer possessed both the knowledge to reference the London matter and the psychological insight to arrange a private meeting that Eleanor would accept without suspicion. The investigation had shifted from a simple village drama to something approaching international intrigue, with roots stretching back to Eleanor's mysterious London life and her late husband's equally mysterious business affairs. The real question now was whether the killer was an outsider who had tracked Eleanor to St. Mary Mead, or someone already established in the village who had discovered her secrets and chosen to exploit them with fatal consequences. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the satisfaction of someone who had spent a productive day gathering intelligence, though she recognized that the most dangerous phase of her investigation was yet to come. The killer, having successfully deflected suspicion onto Crawley, would now be watching carefully for any sign that their deception was being unraveled by an elderly lady with a talent for seeing through the masks that people wore in polite society. The morning after Josiah Crawley's release brought an unsettling quiet to St. Mary Mead that seemed to press against the village like an unwelcome fog. The comfortable certainty of having identified Eleanor's killer had evaporated overnight, leaving behind a residue of nervous glances and hushed conversations that spoke to the community's growing unease. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the patient attention of someone who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly when people felt their security had been threatened. She began her day with a purposeful visit to the post office, where the telephone exchange provided her with a direct connection to the London number found among Eleanor's effects. The crisp voice that answered identified the establishment as Vale and Fellows, solicitors, and informed her with professional courtesy that Mr. Julian Vale was currently away on client business in the countryside, but would return the following day. Miss Marple left her name and the Rose Cottage address, her tone carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to having her requests accommodated. The revelation that the mysterious J was indeed connected to a London legal firm added weight to her growing conviction that Eleanor's death was rooted in carefully concealed complications from her past life. However, the timing of Mr. Vale's absence, coinciding precisely with Eleanor's death, struck Miss Marple as either remarkably convenient or deeply suspicious, depending on one's perspective on coincidence in matters of murder. Her subsequent conversation with young Timothy Forsyth proved illuminating in ways that extended far beyond his obvious nervousness. Timothy had spent a sleepless night wrestling with additional observations that his scholarly conscience insisted were significant, despite his fear of appearing foolish. His description of seeing Eleanor accept a brown envelope from the postmistress's assistant an hour before her final dance provided crucial context for understanding her state of mind during those final hours. It was the sort of envelope that contains legal correspondence, Timothy explained with the precision of someone who had received his share of academic rejections. Eleanor's reaction was quite marked, not distressed exactly, but certainly more serious than one would expect at a village festival. She tucked it into her purse immediately and seemed to lose some of her earlier vivacity. This detail aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's mental reconstruction of Eleanor's final day. The morning visit from the London gentleman, followed by the afternoon delivery of legal correspondence, suggested a pattern of escalating pressure that had culminated in the fatal meeting behind the refreshment marquee. Someone had been orchestrating events with considerable care, using Eleanor's past to manipulate her into a vulnerable position. Miss Marple's return to Rose Cottage, ostensibly to continue organizing Eleanor's effects, yielded a discovery that illuminated the killer's methodical approach to eliminating evidence. While examining Eleanor's personal belongings with the thoroughness of someone genuinely concerned with proper arrangements, she noticed a significant absence that others had overlooked entirely. Eleanor's small silver tin of breath mints, which according to Jessie Drew had been a constant companion due to Eleanor's concern about headaches and social interactions, was nowhere to be found among her possessions. The tin's absence from both Eleanor's bedroom and her scattered purse contents suggested deliberate removal rather than casual misplacement. Miss Marple's experience with human nature told her that such a small, seemingly insignificant item would only be taken if it contained something far more important than mints. The killer had been thorough enough to remove potential evidence while leaving more obvious items untouched, demonstrating a level of calculation that spoke to intimate knowledge of Eleanor's habits. Dr. Haydock's afternoon visit to discuss the upcoming inquest provided Miss Marple with an opportunity to observe the village's most medically knowledgeable resident under circumstances that might reveal telling details. The doctor's continued unease about Eleanor's death had intensified rather than diminished, and his professional instincts clearly remained troubled by the official explanation of natural causes. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Dr. Haydock confided, his usual jovial manner replaced by serious concern. "And I've never encountered a case of sudden cardiac failure that left the victim looking so peaceful." Eleanor's expression suggested surprise rather than the distress one associates with heart problems. "It's as if something unexpected occurred, but not something that caused immediate physical suffering." As they discussed the medical aspects of Eleanor's death, Miss Marple's observant eye noted a small detail that might have escaped anyone less attuned to the significance of minor inconsistencies. Dr. Haydock's usually immaculate medical coat bore a faint, almost imperceptible smear on the left cuff, an iridescent trace that caught the afternoon light in a way that suggested organic material rather than ordinary dust or lint. The color and texture reminded Miss Marple of the distinctive pollen produced by the rhododendron bushes that bordered the vicarage garden, precisely where Eleanor's body had been discovered. While Dr. Haydock had been among the first to examine Eleanor at the scene, the positioning of the pollen trace suggested contact that preceded his official medical assessment. The detail was too subtle for accusation, but significant enough to mark Dr. Haydock as someone whose movements on the day of Eleanor's death deserved closer scrutiny. As evening approached and the village settled into its new rhythm of cautious watchfulness, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from her careful observations. Eleanor's killer was someone with medical knowledge sufficient to cause death without obvious violence, legal connections that provided access to Eleanor's past, and intimate familiarity with village routines that allowed them to exploit the festival's chaos. The sophistication required suggested not a crime of passion, but a carefully planned elimination of someone who had become inconveniently knowledgeable about secrets that others were desperate to protect. The missing tin of mints, the strategic timing of legal correspondence, and the subtle physical evidence all pointed toward a killer who remained hidden among St. Mary Mead's respectable residents, confident that their carefully constructed facade would continue to deflect suspicion onto more obvious candidates. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the satisfaction of someone who had spent a productive day gathering threads that would soon weave themselves into a clear pattern of guilt, though she recognized that the most dangerous phase of her investigation was yet to come. The morning following Dr. Haydock's troubling revelation brought an unexpected visitor to St. Mary Mead in the form of Mr. Julian Vale, the London solicitor whose name had appeared on Eleanor's correspondence. Miss Marple observed his arrival from her cottage window, a tall, distinguished gentleman in his late 40s who carried himself with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling delicate legal matters. His immediate destination was Rose Cottage, where he spent nearly an hour examining Eleanor's papers with the methodical thoroughness of professional obligation. When Mr. Vale called upon Miss Marple later that morning, his manner carried the courteous gravity of someone bearing important information. He declined her offer of tea initially, then accepted with the grateful smile of a man who recognized genuine hospitality when encountered. His explanation of the mysterious London matter proved both illuminating and troubling in equal measure. "I must clarify, Miss Marple," he began with careful precision, "that I did not write the note found at the scene of Mrs. Vance's death. While the initial J might suggest my involvement, I would never summon a lady to such an inappropriate venue for confidential business. My correspondence with Mrs. Vance concerned irregularities in a trust established by her late husband for the benefit of a young person, irregularities that occurred during Mr. Vance's final illness, when his judgment may have been compromised by well-meaning advisers. The solicitor's revelation cast Eleanor's final weeks in an entirely different light. Rather than living peacefully in retirement, she had been grappling with the discovery that someone had manipulated her dying husband's financial arrangements, exploiting his illness and her trust to divert funds intended for a vulnerable beneficiary. Eleanor's determination to make restitution, despite the personal cost to her reputation, spoke to a courage that had ultimately proven fatal. Mrs. Vance was prepared to face considerable social embarrassment to correct these irregularities. Mr. Vale continued, his tone carrying genuine admiration for his deceased client. She had resolved to pursue the matter through proper legal channels, regardless of the consequences to herself or others involved. It required remarkable moral courage, particularly given her position in this community. Miss Marple's subsequent conversations with various villagers revealed the subtle ways in which Eleanor's final weeks had been marked by increasing tension. Mrs. Henderson recalled Eleanor's unusual preoccupation, her tendency to check her correspondence with nervous energy, and her cryptic references to doing what's right, whatever the cost. Timothy Forsyth mentioned seeing Eleanor in deep conversation with Dr. Haydock outside the post office, their exchange marked by the kind of intensity that suggested serious disagreement rather than casual medical consultation. Most significantly, young Timothy's scholarly interest in botanical specimens provided crucial insight into the physical evidence surrounding Eleanor's death. His detailed knowledge of the vicarage garden's rhododendron varieties confirmed that the pollen traces observed on Dr. Haydock's coat came from the specific pink pearl cultivar that bordered the area where Eleanor's body was discovered. The sticky nature of this particular pollen made accidental transfer unlikely unless someone had been in direct contact with the bush during the crucial time period. I observed Dr. Haydock near that exact location quite early in the proceedings, Timothy confided to Miss Marple with scholarly precision. Before the official examination, before the police secured the area, he appeared rather agitated, examining the ground with unusual intensity. At the time, I assumed he was looking for signs of what might have caused Mrs. Vance's collapse, but his behavior seemed more personal than professional. Dr. Haydock's continued unease about Eleanor's death, combined with his intimate knowledge of her medical history and his early presence at the scene, created a pattern that troubled Miss Marple's experienced instincts. His professional competence was unquestioned, but his behavior suggested someone wrestling with knowledge that extended beyond medical assessment of natural death. The missing tin of breath mints remained a persistent puzzle that seemed to hold particular significance for understanding Eleanor's final moments. Miss Marple's careful inquiries revealed that Eleanor's headaches had been a constant companion, managed through a specific type of pastille purchased from a Temple Bar chemist in London. The tin's absence from both her personal effects and the scene of her death suggested deliberate removal by someone who understood its importance. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychological profile of Eleanor's killer. This was someone with intimate knowledge of Eleanor's habits and medical needs, access to her personal routine, and sufficient sophistication to exploit the chaos of a village festival for murderous purposes. The killer possessed both the means to cause death without obvious violence and the social position to deflect suspicion onto more obvious targets. The revelation that Eleanor had been working to expose financial irregularities added a compelling motive to the growing list of suspicious circumstances. Someone with access to the Vance family's financial affairs during Mr. Vance's final illness would have had both opportunity and incentive to prevent Eleanor's investigation from reaching its conclusion. The timing of her death, just as she prepared to take decisive legal action, suggested a killer who understood the immediate threat to their carefully concealed crimes. Miss Marple's evening routine included a careful review of the day's observations, each detail contributing to a pattern that was slowly but inexorably pointing toward a conclusion that would shock the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The killer remained hidden among the community's most respected residents, confident that their reputation would continue to shield them from suspicion, unaware that an elderly lady with a talent for understanding human nature was methodically unraveling the deception that had cost Eleanor Vance her life. The stage was set for a more direct confrontation, one that would test not only Miss Marple's deductive abilities, but her understanding of how far a desperate person might go to protect secrets that had already claimed one life and might well claim another before justice could prevail. The morning light filtering through Miss Marple's cottage windows found her already dressed and contemplating the delicate china pattern on her breakfast cup with the same methodical attention she applied to unraveling human deception. The previous day's revelations about Eleanor's legal troubles and the mysterious London matter had crystallized her growing certainty that the widow's death was neither natural nor accidental, but the calculated elimination of someone who had become inconveniently knowledgeable about carefully hidden crimes. Her first visitor arrived before the church bells had finished their morning call. Jessie Drew appeared at the kitchen door, her pale face bearing the telltale signs of a sleepless night spent wrestling with conscience and fear. The young maid's hands trembled as she accepted Miss Marple's invitation to sit, her usual deference replaced by the desperate urgency of someone who could no longer bear the weight of concealed knowledge. "I must tell someone," Jessie whispered, glancing nervously toward the windows as if expecting to be overheard. "About the note that was found with Mrs. Vance. I didn't write it, miss, though I delivered it to her purse when she wasn't looking. A gentleman came to Rose Cottage that morning, well dressed with a London accent, and gave me $1 to slip it into her things. Said she would understand the initial J, and that it was urgent business that couldn't wait." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she absorbed this crucial revelation. The forged note, with its careful reference to the London matter, had been planted by someone with intimate knowledge of Eleanor's legal troubles. Someone sophisticated enough to manipulate a frightened servant girl into unwitting complicity. The killer had orchestrated Eleanor's final meeting with methodical precision, using her own trust and sense of responsibility to lure her to an isolated location. "This gentleman," Miss Marple inquired gently, "did you observe anything particular about his appearance or manner?" Jessie's brow furrowed with the effort of frightened recollection. "He wore dark gloves, miss, and had a ring with letters carved into it. Spoke like quality, but there was something about his eyes that made me nervous. When I asked if I should sign a proper name, he laughed and said the initial would be quite sufficient for Mrs. Vance's understanding." The morning's second shock came in the form of Mrs. Henderson's breathless arrival, her usually composed demeanor shattered by the discovery of a break-in at Rose Cottage. The intruder had ignored Eleanor's modest jewelry and silver, focusing instead on her private study with the desperate thoroughness of someone searching for specific evidence. Drawers had been ransacked, papers scattered, and Eleanor's delicate writing desk forced open with such violence that its antique lock lay broken on the Persian carpet. Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Henderson to examine the scene, her observant eye immediately noting the methodical nature of the search, despite its apparent chaos. This was not random vandalism, but a targeted hunt for something the killer believed Eleanor had hidden among her personal effects. The timing, coming so soon after the revelation of Eleanor's legal investigation, suggested growing desperation on the part of someone who realized their carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. Inspector Slack's assessment of the break-in as the work of someone looking for something specific aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own conclusions, though she suspected the inspector failed to grasp the full implications of the crime's sophisticated planning. The killer remained active and dangerous, driven by the knowledge that Eleanor had taken precautions to ensure her investigation would survive her death. Dr. Haydock's arrival at the cottage to examine the break-in scene provided Miss Marple with another opportunity to observe the village's most medically knowledgeable resident under circumstances that might reveal telling details. His obvious agitation seemed to extend beyond professional concern for the community's safety. and his careful examination of Eleanor's scattered papers suggested personal interest in what the intruder might have discovered. Eleanor mentioned to me that she had taken certain precautions, Dr. Haydock confided to Miss Marple as they stood in the violated study. She spoke of a safeguard that would ensure her efforts weren't wasted, even if something unfortunate occurred. Said it was hidden in plain sight, where only someone who knew her intimately would think to look. The doctor's revelation about Eleanor's mysterious safeguard cast the missing tin of breath mints in an entirely new light. Such an innocuous personal item would indeed be hidden in plain sight, easily overlooked by someone frantically searching through legal documents and correspondence. If Eleanor had used the tin to conceal evidence of the financial irregularities she was investigating, its absence from both her personal effects and the scene of her death suggested the killer's intimate knowledge of her habits and routines. As the day progressed and news of the break-in spread through St. Mary Mead, the village's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The comfortable assumption that Eleanor's death was an isolated tragedy had been shattered by the evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years began eyeing each other with suspicion, wondering which among them harbored secrets dark enough to justify murder. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening with the satisfaction of someone who had spent a productive day gathering crucial intelligence, though she recognized that the killer's growing desperation made the situation increasingly dangerous. The methodical elimination of evidence, the sophisticated manipulation of witnesses, and the intimate knowledge of Eleanor's personal habits all pointed toward someone who had gained her trust completely before betraying it with fatal consequences. The stage was set for a more direct confrontation, one that would test not only Miss Marple's deductive abilities, but her understanding of how far a desperate person would go to protect secrets that had already claimed one life and threatened to destroy the carefully constructed facade of respectability that concealed a killer's true nature. The morning after the break-in at Rose Cottage brought a peculiar quality to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself was holding its breath. The festival bunting still fluttered between the ancient oaks, now seeming less festive than forlorn, a reminder of how quickly celebration could transform into tragedy. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with her usual precision, penned 2 careful letters, one to the Temple Bar chemist whose label she had discovered among Eleanor's effects, and another to Mr. Julian Vale requesting specific details about the trust beneficiary whose inheritance had been compromised. The responses to her inquiries arrived with remarkable promptness, delivered by the Morning Post with an efficiency that spoke to the gravity of the situation. The telegram from Frobisher and Lyle, the distinguished chemist, proved particularly illuminating in its stark brevity. Order collected 2 days prior. Stop cash payment. Stop gentleman gave name Vale. Stop description. Tall gloves. Dark coat. Signet ring initials unreadable. Stop regret cannot identify further. Miss Marple studied the telegram with the careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern, noting how each detail aligned perfectly with Jessie Drew's description of the mysterious visitor who had arranged Eleanor's final meeting. Someone with considerable sophistication had orchestrated the entire deception, from the forged credentials to the manipulation of an innocent servant girl, demonstrating both legal knowledge and psychological insight. Young Timothy Forsyth's scholarly precision provided the next crucial piece of evidence when he arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with his meticulously maintained journal of village activities. His academic habits, which some villagers found tedious, proved invaluable for establishing the precise timeline that would ultimately expose the killer's careful planning. I noticed something rather peculiar in reviewing my notes, Timothy explained with characteristic thoroughness, adjusting his spectacles as he consulted his neat handwriting. Dr. Haydock has had an unusual number of emergency calls to neighboring villages during the past month, always coinciding with times when Mrs. Vance had appointments with her London solicitor. The pattern seemed too consistent to be mere coincidence. This revelation cast Dr. Haydock's behavior, in an entirely different light, suggesting not only guilty knowledge of Eleanor's investigation, but active surveillance of her activities. The respected village doctor had been monitoring Eleanor's efforts to expose the financial irregularities, timing his absences to avoid being present when she might discuss sensitive matters with her legal advisor. Inspector Slack's afternoon visit brought official confirmation of what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect. The mysterious London gentleman who had visited Eleanor on the morning of her death had been identified as an impostor, someone using forged credentials and assumed identity to gain access to Eleanor's correspondence and assess the extent of her dangerous knowledge. Sophisticated bit of work, Inspector Slack admitted with grudging professional respect. The forged documents were expertly prepared, bearing signatures that required considerable medical knowledge to execute convincingly. We're dealing with someone who understands both legal procedures and human psychology well enough to orchestrate Mrs. Vance's death with remarkable precision. Armed with this accumulating evidence, Miss Marple decided the time had come for a more direct, though characteristically subtle, approach to testing her growing certainty about Dr. Haydick's guilt. She arranged what appeared to be a casual tea gathering, inviting several key figures, including the doctor himself, ostensibly to discuss the ongoing investigation and share information that might help resolve the mystery. Dr. Haydock arrived with his customary professional warmth, though Miss Marple's observant eye noted the slight tension in his manner and the way his hands betrayed nervous energy despite his controlled demeanor. As the conversation turned to Eleanor's final days and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death, Miss Marple introduced seemingly innocent observations that carried deeper implications for anyone with guilty knowledge. Such a peculiar thing about Eleanor's breath mints, Miss Marple remarked with gentle casualness, passing the tea service with practiced grace. She was so particular about that little tin from the Temple Bar chemist. Frobisher and Lyle, I believe. Such a reliable establishment, though I understand they had a rather unusual customer recently. Someone claiming to be Mr. Vale who collected an order just before our festival. The effect of this seemingly innocent comment was immediate and telling. Dr. Haydick's cup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer before he controlled the tremor, and his response carried the particular care of someone choosing words with unusual precision. "One does encounter all sorts of people in London establishments," he said, his voice maintaining professional composure, while his eyes revealed something approaching alarm, though I can't imagine why anyone would impersonate a solicitor to purchase simple breath mints. Miss Marple's gentle smile acknowledged his response, while her keen mind catalogued the significance of his reaction. The combination of medical knowledge, legal sophistication, and intimate familiarity with Eleanor's habits created a profile that fit the respected village doctor with uncomfortable precision. His growing desperation, evidenced by the break-in at Rose Cottage and his increasingly transparent attempts to locate Eleanor's hidden evidence, marked him as particularly dangerous to anyone who might threaten his carefully constructed facade. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and her guests departed, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological complexity of a killer who had maintained the appearance of medical dedication while systematically eliminating someone who threatened to expose his earlier crimes. Dr. Haydock's manipulation of Eleanor's trust, his exploitation of her medical dependence, and his calculated use of the village festival as cover for murder demonstrated a level of moral corruption that was particularly shocking in someone whose profession was dedicated to preserving life. The stage was now set for the final confrontation, though Miss Marple recognized that proving Dr. Haydick's guilt would require considerable courage and even more careful planning. The missing breath mint tin remained the crucial piece of evidence that could definitively expose his crimes, assuming Eleanor had indeed used it to conceal documentation of the trust fund irregularities that had cost her life. The respected village doctor had already killed once to protect his secrets, and Miss Marple had no doubt he would kill again rather than face exposure and the destruction of his reputation. The morning light cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple prepared for what she recognized would be the most delicate and dangerous phase of her investigation. The previous evening's careful observations had confirmed her suspicions about Dr. Haydock's guilt, but proving it would require a strategy that combined psychological insight with considerable personal courage. She had spent the early hours arranging what appeared to be innocent coincidences, but were actually carefully orchestrated elements of a trap designed to expose a killer who had already demonstrated both cunning and ruthlessness. Mr. Julian Vale's morning visit provided the final pieces of evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. The London solicitor arrived bearing documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic financial manipulation during Mr. Vance's final illness. The trust beneficiary, he explained with professional gravity, was James Rowan, a 17-year-old orphan whose education fund had been systematically diverted through a local medical intermediary to finance what appeared to be legitimate charitable research but was actually personal enrichment disguised as professional advancement. The paperwork bears signatures that are expertly forged, Mr. Vale explained, his voice carrying the weight of legal certainty. Someone with intimate knowledge of Mr. Vance's condition and considerable medical expertise manipulated a dying man's generosity for personal gain. Mrs. Vance's determination to expose these irregularities, regardless of the social embarrassment to herself, ultimately cost her life. Armed with this confirmation, Miss Marple implemented her carefully planned strategy. She dispatched a series of seemingly innocent messages that would, if her understanding of human psychology proved correct, create irresistible pressure on Dr. Haydock's already strained composure. The key was to convince him that Eleanor's hidden evidence had been discovered and was about to be examined by proper authorities, forcing him into a desperate attempt to retrieve or destroy it. The church vestry provided the perfect setting for her psychological trap. During the afternoon Mothers' Union meeting, Miss Marple arranged for Mrs. Clement to place a small wrapped package on the oak table near the memorial plaque, announcing with suitable gravity that it was Eleanor's missing personal effects, discovered in the lost property drawer and awaiting proper examination by Mr. Vale and Inspector Slack. Dr. Haydock's arrival at the vestry carried all the hallmarks of desperate calculation disguised as professional courtesy. His offer to examine the church's medical supplies for the upcoming harvest festival seemed plausible enough, but Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the way his attention focused immediately on the wrapped package, his professional composure barely concealing the anxiety that drove his seemingly casual inquiries. "Such a tragic loss," Dr. Haydock remarked, positioning himself near the table with practiced casualness. "Eleanor was remarkably healthy for her age. I can't imagine what might have caused such sudden cardiac failure, though these things do happen unexpectedly, particularly when people overexert themselves with unusual activities like vigorous dancing." Miss Marple's gentle response carried implications that struck at the heart of his carefully constructed deception. "How fortunate that Eleanor took such precautions with her important documents," she observed with innocent precision. She mentioned to several people that she had hidden crucial evidence in the most unlikely place, somewhere only someone who knew her intimately would think to look. Her little tin of breath mints, perhaps, which she carried everywhere but which seems to have disappeared so mysteriously. The effect of this seemingly casual observation was immediate and devastating. Dr. Haydock's hand moved instinctively toward the wrapped package before he controlled the gesture, his medical training warring with psychological compulsion as he realized the trap closing around him. His subsequent attempt to discredit Eleanor's mental state revealed the full scope of his desperation and provided Miss Marple with the confirmation she needed. Eleanor had been suffering from increasingly severe headaches, Dr. Haydock declared with false professional authority. "I prescribed specific medication to help manage her condition, though I feared the stress of her legal investigations might be affecting her judgment. She spoke of imaginary threats and seemed convinced that someone was monitoring her activities, which suggested possible paranoid delusions. Miss Marple's quiet response cut through his deception with surgical precision. "How interesting that you should mention her medication, Doctor, particularly since the Temple Bar chemist confirmed that someone impersonating Mr. Vale collected her special order just before the festival. Someone with medical knowledge who understood exactly how her particular prescription might be modified to produce different effects." The confrontation reached its climax when Dr. Haydock, driven by the knowledge that his carefully planned deception was unraveling, made his fatal mistake. His attempt to examine the wrapped package, ostensibly to verify its contents for medical reasons, was intercepted by Inspector Slack, who had been positioned in the anteroom precisely for this moment. The digitalis was administered through her breath mints, Dr. Haydock confessed, with the bitter satisfaction of someone finally able to share the burden of his crimes. A carefully measured dose that would mimic cardiac arrest while leaving no obvious trace. Eleanor's habit of taking the mints when she felt anxious made it simple to ensure she would consume the fatal dose during our prearranged meeting. The recovery of Eleanor's actual evidence from her dancing shoes, where she had concealed the crucial documents in the false heel, provided conclusive proof of Dr. Haydock's systematic embezzlement and calculated murder. The irony that the vibrant woman who had danced with such joy at her final festival had literally carried the evidence of her killer's guilt in her feet seemed a fitting tribute to Eleanor's determination that justice should survive her death. As Inspector Slack led the respected village doctor away in handcuffs, Miss Marple reflected on the particular tragedy of trust betrayed by someone whose profession was dedicated to preserving life, and whose position in the community had provided both opportunity and cover for the most calculated form of murder. The silence that settled over St. Mary Mead in the hours following Dr. Haydock's arrest was unlike any the village had experienced in living memory. It was not the comfortable quiet of evening routines or Sunday afternoon rest, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that follows the shattering of fundamental assumptions about the nature of trust and respectability. Miss Marple, walking slowly home through the familiar lanes, observed how curtains were drawn earlier than usual, how conversations ceased abruptly when she approached, how the very air seemed to carry the weight of collective disbelief. The full scope of Dr. Haydock's crimes emerged gradually through Inspector Slack's methodical investigation, each revelation adding depth to the portrait of systematic betrayal that had begun with financial manipulation and culminated in calculated murder. The respected village doctor had exploited his position as Mr. Vance's attending physician during the old man's final illness, using his medical authority to facilitate the transfer of young James Rowan's educational trust into accounts that funded his own research while maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable work. Mr. Julian Vale's examination of Eleanor's hidden evidence revealed the sophisticated nature of Dr. Haydock's approach to murder. The digitalis, a powerful cardiac glycoside commonly used in heart medications, had been carefully incorporated into Eleanor's prescribed headache pastilles from the Temple Bar chemist. The doctor's intimate knowledge of her medical habits, her reliance on the breath mints to manage anxiety and headaches, had provided him with the perfect delivery method for a slow-acting poison designed to mimic sudden cardiac arrest. The beauty of it, from a criminal perspective, Inspector Slack explained to Miss Marple with reluctant professional admiration, was that digitalis occurs naturally in foxglove plants. Even if detected, it might have been dismissed as accidental exposure during her gardening activities. Dr. Haydock's medical knowledge allowed him to calculate a dose that would prove fatal during the stress and excitement of the festival, while leaving no obvious trace of foul play. Young Timothy Forsyth, whose scholarly observations had proved crucial to the investigation, found his academic worldview profoundly altered by his encounter with real-world evil. His subsequent correspondence with James Rowan, now 18 and preparing for university with his restored inheritance, reflected a new understanding that scholarship properly applied could indeed serve justice and human kindness. Jessie Drew, the pale young maid whose testimony had helped expose Dr. Haydock's manipulation, found new employment with Mrs. Henderson, who appreciated both her honesty and her courage in coming forward despite her terror. The girl's willingness to reveal her unwitting role in the killer's deception had been crucial to understanding how Dr. Haydock had orchestrated Eleanor's final meeting while maintaining his own apparent innocence. Mrs. Price Ridley's reaction proved particularly revealing of the village's psychological state. Her initial satisfaction at having suspected outsiders like Josiah Crawley was quickly overwhelmed by the uncomfortable realization that she had trusted her own health to a man capable of calculated murder. "One simply doesn't know," she confided to anyone willing to listen, "whom one can trust anymore, if a doctor, a man dedicated to healing, can commit such acts." The following year's summer festival included a memorial garden dedicated to Eleanor's memory, where roses bloomed alongside the rhododendrons that had inadvertently helped expose her killer. The dancing that had been such a source of joy and mild controversy during Eleanor's lifetime was remembered with appreciation rather than disapproval, as the villagers came to understand that her exuberant expression of life had been a form of courage that deserved celebration rather than censure. James Rowan attended the memorial service, a serious young man whose gratitude to Eleanor's memory was matched only by his determination to use his restored education fund wisely. Mr. Vale had ensured that the full extent of his rightful inheritance, along with substantial restitution, would support not only his university education, but also a charitable foundation in Eleanor's name, dedicated to protecting vulnerable beneficiaries from financial exploitation. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often found herself reflecting on the particular tragedy of Eleanor Vance's death, while tending her garden in the golden afternoon light. The vibrant widow who had brought such joy to the village through her uninhibited dancing had been eliminated by someone who represented everything she had opposed: the calculated exploitation of trust, the manipulation of the vulnerable, and the corruption of professional responsibility for personal gain. The case had been solved, as most of her investigations were, through careful observation of human nature rather than sophisticated forensic analysis. Dr. Haydock's downfall had come not from any single dramatic revelation, but from the accumulation of small inconsistencies. Eleanor's surprised rather than pained expression, the missing tin of breath mints, the forged note with its calculated initial, the convenient pattern of his absences during Eleanor's London consultations, and most tellingly, his intimate knowledge of her personal habits that had allowed him to exploit her trust so completely. "It was never one large thing," Miss Marple mused to Mrs. Clement over tea one peaceful evening, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. Dr. Haydock understood psychology well enough to manipulate Eleanor's sense of responsibility, using her determination to protect young James Rowan as the very mechanism that lured her to her death. But he underestimated the power of a woman's intuition when it came to protecting evidence. Eleanor knew she was in danger, and she took precautions. The widow who had danced alone in life had found justice through the patient investigation of someone who understood that truth, like the most complex knitting pattern, revealed itself gradually through careful attention to details that others might overlook. Eleanor's vibrant spirit lived on not only in the memory of her joyful dancing, but in the knowledge that her courage had ultimately protected an innocent young man from the consequences of adult greed and deception. St. Mary Mead settled back into its peaceful routine, though with a deeper understanding of the complexities that could exist beneath the surface of even the most respectable community. The maypole still stood on the village green, its ribbons fluttering in the autumn breeze, a reminder that life continued its eternal dance between light and shadow, trust and betrayal, the innocent and the calculating. And Miss Marple returned to her roses and her knitting, ever watchful for the subtle signs that revealed the true nature of human character, knowing that in a world where evil could wear the mask of respectability, vigilance was the price of justice.